Most Americans didn't notice what just happened in September 2025. While Washington's attention was focused on the elections, two leaders announced a strategic partnership that could rewrite the geography of economic power in North America. Mark Carney of Canada and Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico didn't just sign a trade agreement, they built an institutional fortress 9 months before. Donald Trump could use the mechanism he himself created as a weapon of continental blackmail. And let me be absolutely clear, what's at stake here is not just a trade treaty. It's the ability of a president to use the architecture of free trade as an instrument of geopolitical subordination. And the reason this matters, the reason it should alarm anyone who understands how power works when rules become ammunition, is that Trump is repeating exactly the mistake that destroyed American credibility in recent decades, confusing temporary dependence with permanent obedience. Here's what most people miss. When Trump negotiated USMCA in 2018, replacing NAFTA, his trade representative Robert Lighthizer inserted a poison pill, Article 34.7. This provision requires the three countries to meet 6 years after implementation, July 2026, to decide whether to extend the agreement for another 16 years or allow it to gradually expire by 2036. Lighthizer believed that permanent agreements removed American leverage. He wanted a recurring pressure point where the United States could extract concessions under threat of withdrawal. Canada and Mexico accepted, not because they liked it. They accepted because the alternative was Trump immediately tearing up NAFTA and throwing the continent into chaos. They bet that 6 years of stability were worth the risk, hoping that Trump wouldn't be there anymore or that his approach would have moderated. They appear to have miscalculated. This didn't happen overnight. To understand what's unfolding now, you need to track how Trump has weaponized trade agreements since he returned to power. In December 2024, he began threatening tariffs against Canada and Mexico, citing national security, a justification that allows circumventing USMCA protections. He imposed tariffs, offered exemptions in exchange for submission on issues that have nothing to do with trade, military spending, migration control, blocking Chinese investment, fentanyl interdiction. This is the pattern. Trump doesn't negotiate, he extorts, and he believes the July 2026 deadline gives him absolute power to rewrite North American relations on exclusively American terms. He assumes that Canada and Mexico desperately need the American market and that the threat of withdrawal will force obedience. But while he was threatening, something unexpected happened. In September 2025, 9 months before the deadline, Trump planned to use as a negotiating guillotine. Canada and Mexico announced a comprehensive strategic partnership, not symbolic, strategic, with supply chain integration, historic trade missions, explicit diplomatic coordination. The stated goal: build alternatives before Trump sits down at the table. Think about that, absorb that. Two countries historically suspicious of each other, with radically different economies and cultures, decided that the American threat was so clear, so imminent, that it was worth overcoming decades of rivalry to build an institutional shield. The Canadian ambassador to Mexico was crystal clear. Canada and Mexico will need each other more than ever. Here's what exactly happened. According to official reports, Canada is planning the largest trade mission in its history to Mexico for early 2026. Hundreds of Canadian companies, 6 strategic sectors, ministers leading delegations. The goal is not exploration, it's creating facts on the ground. When negotiations begin, these contracts will already be signed, these supply chains will already be operating. Mexico wants access to Canadian Pacific ports to export to Asia without passing through American territory. Canada wants to use Mexican manufacturing to access Latin American markets. Both are members of CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that guarantees preferential access to 11 Pacific countries, regardless of USMCA's fate. Translation: if the agreement expires or if Trump imposes unacceptable terms, they have alternatives. Not perfect substitutes, certainly, but alternatives sufficient to make American threats less terrifying than Trump imagines. But this still isn't the most serious part. In December 2025, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office held mandatory public consultations in Washington. Over 3 days, nearly 150 American industry leaders testified. The message was unanimous. USMCA is essential and needs to be renewed. The National Association of Manufacturers declared that terminating it would be an economic catastrophe. The American Automotive Policy Council emphasized that deeply integrated supply chains cannot be quickly restructured. Agricultural groups testified that Canada and Mexico represent critical markets that American farmers cannot afford to lose. Let me repeat that. And these are core Republican-based groups, and they revealed something crucial. American industry depends as much on imports from Canada and Mexico as those countries depend on the American market. Canadian energy keeps American cities and factories running. Canadian critical minerals are essential for American technology and defense. Mexican manufacturing provides cost efficiencies that enable American global competitiveness. So tell me, if American industries cannot afford to lose USMCA and if Canada and Mexico are building alternatives, who exactly holds the leverage here? Here's what Washington doesn't want to admit. Trump is using a 1980s negotiating strategy in a continental economy. Integrated over 3 decades, he views trade as a unilateral concession. The U.S. grants market access in exchange for compliance. But 30 years of integration have created interdependencies that flow in multiple directions and cannot be severed without severe damage to all parties. When you threaten to tear up that integration, you force the other side to build alternatives that reduce your own future leverage. Trump is essentially pushing his neighbors toward exactly the coordination that undermines his strategy. I've been following trade negotiations for decades, and I can tell you, threats only work when the other side believes they have no choice. The response from Canada and Mexico suggests they're re-preparing to demonstrate they have choices Trump didn't think they possessed. Trump's explicit strategy involves negotiating separately with Canada and Mexico, divide and conquer, but this assumes they won't coordinate, despite having every incentive to do so. It assumes threats will paralyze them rather than galvanize them into exactly the partnership that destroys American leverage. Now, let me draw a parallel that should be obvious to anyone who has studied American history. In the 1960s and 1970s, the United States used its dominant position in the Bretton Woods system to force European allies to finance American wars and absorb American inflation. Washington assumed that, since the dollar was the global reserve currency and since Europe needed American security against the Soviet Union, the Allies had no choice but to submit. Until they did, France began converting dollars to gold. Germany built commercial relationships with Eastern Europe. Europe gradually built institutions, eventually the European Union, that reduced American dependence. When Nixon was forced to abandon the gold standard in 1971, it was because allies had built sufficient alternatives to make American demands unsustainable. The logic is the same. The tolerance is what changed, or rather, Trump is testing whether continental neighbors' tolerance is infinite. If this were happening on any other continent, if we saw a leader using treaty review clauses to extort allies on non-trade issues while those allies secretly build defensive alliances, Washington would call this economic authoritarianism. American analysts would describe it as erosion of liberal norms. International institutions would issue warnings about regional destabilization. But because it's happening in North America, with Trump as protagonist, we treat it as robust trade policy. Here's what will happen if current trends continue. Scenario 1, Trump refuses to extend USMCA or imposes unacceptable terms. The agreement enters annual reviews until expiring in 2036. Uncertainty depresses investment in all 3 countries. But meanwhile, Canada and Mexico accelerate bilateral integration. Supply chains between them deepen. Both expand agreements with Pacific, European, and Latin American partners. American negotiators discover that annual reviews provide decreasing leverage as alternatives mature. Scenario 2, Trump forces an extension on his terms. Canada and Mexico formally accept, but continue building alternatives as insurance against future extortion. Institutional confidence in the North American trading system collapses. Investors treat any agreement as temporary and vulnerable to political whims. The continent loses global competitiveness as companies move operations to regions with greater regulatory stability. Scenario 3, the most dangerous. Trump assumes threats will suffice and doesn't build a domestic coalition to sustain them, and discovers in July 2026 that Canada and Mexico arrive not as desperate supplicants, but as partners who have built alternatives. Negotiations collapse. USMCA expires. A decade of integration unravels. All 3 economies suffer, but the long-term damage is asymmetric because Canada and Mexico will have built the institutional infrastructure to continue without the U.S., while American industries discover they've lost the privileged access they treated as permanent. The most likely scenario is the most dangerous because Trump doesn't understand that power in modern economic relations is not merely a function of market size, it's a function of alternatives, pain tolerance, and the ability to credibly threaten departure. If Canada and Mexico arrive having built alternatives while American industries publicly beg for USMCA's continuation, the balance of power looks quite different. Each delay makes correction more costly, each threat pushes neighbors deeper into coordination. Each month that Canada and Mexico use to integrate supply chains is a month producing future American leverage. The deadline that was supposed to give Trump maximum power may reveal he has less control than he imagined, because threats stopped working the moment the other side began building the capacity to say no. And here's what this really means. Trump weaponized USMCA. He transformed an agreement of mutual benefit into a tool of coercion. And in doing so, he forced America's neighbors to calculate whether submission serves their interests or whether building alternatives offers better security. Once that calculation changes, once the leverage you assume was permanent proves contingent on the goodwill you systematically eroded, you discover you're no longer dictating terms. You're renegotiating from a weakened position with partners who no longer need to fear your threats. This isn't about free trade versus protectionism. It's not about tariffs or deficits. It's about whether the United States understands that power in the 21st century doesn't come from the capacity to inflict pain, but from the capacity to build arrangements that other nations have an interest in preserving. The line has been crossed. The precedent has been written in permanent ink. Future presidents will inherit a continent where America's neighbors arrive at negotiations, having built institutional infrastructure to function independently of Washington, where the threat of American withdrawal doesn't paralyze but accelerates alternatives. Trump wanted to demonstrate strength. He may be demonstrating the limits of coercion when applied to partners who have the capacity, resources, and now the motivation to respond by building exactly what undermines the source of the threat. And history is not usually kind to empires that confuse neighbors' temporary fear with permanent respect.